Hi, welcome back. We've talked about how corporate financial decisions vary as companies move through the life cycle. We've talked about how valuation challenges shift as you move through the life cycle. We've talked about how investment philosophies are different across the life cycle. In this session, I want to focus on managing companies, how management challenges change as companies move through the life cycle, and the types of people you want running companies have to change with those challenges. So let's step back and think about what top managers do. What does the CEO of a company do? As I see it, there are five key elements to what a CEO does. The first is, in any publicly traded company, the CEO is the narrative setter, the storyteller. Second, the CEO also is the business manager. He or she might not make the decisions at the nuts and bolts level, but they pick the people who make the decisions and oversee them. Third, CEOs are also people leaders. They've got to inspire, they've got to lead, and when challenges come up, they've got to be at the front. Fourth, they're the public face of companies, whether you like it or not. When a company is in trouble or is doing well, the CEO is often the face of the company. And fifth, the CEO has to be working on a succession plan. When he or she leaves, who will take over the company? Those are all roles that managers have. But if you step back and think about how much does the CEO management matter, it depends on the company. I would argue that if you're the CEO of a macro-based company, a commodity company, you matter less than if you're the CEO of a consumer product company. You run an oil company, what happens to oil prices will have a much more significant effect on how your company does than any decision you make. Doesn't mean that CEOs don't matter to oil companies, but they matter less. Micro-based companies tend to be more affected by who the top management is. Macro companies are less affected. Since we're talking about life cycle, I'm going to argue that early in the life cycle, management matters a lot more than when you get to the middle of the life cycle. A mature company can run an autopilot. A young startup cannot. And then when you go into decline, management starts to matter again. Companies with strong and significant competitive advantages, a brand name that everybody recognizes, cost advantages over the competition. The CEO matters less than companies where that competitive advantage is weaker and requires management to keep it intact. Remember we talked about transition points? From startup to young company to high growth company, high growth to mature growth, and how transitions are challenging. Management matters more if you're approaching a transition point. Good management can ease you through a transition. And there's one final parameter where management matters more. If you're in a business where if there's upside, you need management to take advantage of it and build more upside. If there's downside, get you out of the downside quickly. Management matters more in businesses where there's optionality, both on the upside and the downside. So if you think about a great CEO and you read the Harvard Business Review or McKinsey, there's a mythology of what goes into a great CEO. I pulled this out of a McKinsey quarterly description of the things that a great CEO does. They focus on beating the odds. They manage the performance of the company. They put dynamics. As you look at those qualities, they're all great qualities, right? You're saying, who would not want that in a CEO? I personally think that the great CEO notion is a myth, and here's why. It's built on selective and anecdotal evidence. How do they come up with these lists? They pick a CEO and say, what does that CEO have? Let's make it a list. Second, have you noticed that great CEOs, if you look at the qualities, they're all good qualities? How come great CEOs don't have any bad qualities? Overconfidence, quick to act, impulsive. Maybe those are the things you need in a CEO. How come they never show up on the list? Third, I would argue that for every great CEO you can point to that has those qualities, I can point to a great CEO, somebody who's created an amazing company who doesn't have those qualities. And even the greatest of CEOs, the ones that these mythologies are based on, have had periods of failure that they've come back from. And many of the great CEOs that were anointed great at the time they were looked at, 2 decades later, 3 decades later, when you look back at them, turn out not to be that great after all. They had their flaws. The reason I believe this notion of a great CEO is so dangerous, it depends on where you are in the life cycle. Let's start off. You're a startup. What kind of person do you want running your company? Remember, a startup, it's all about story. You need the story to attract investors. You need the story to attract employees. You need the story to even start thinking about a business model. You want a CEO who is a visionary, who can go out and frame that story. Then you become a young growth company. What are you trying to do? You're trying to build a business model. You're trying to build a business. You want people who are pragmatic. Pure visionaries can never run businesses because they're unwilling to compromise on their vision. You need somebody who's pragmatic enough to say, I have a vision, but I'm willing to accept compromises. You're building a business model. Then you become a high growth company, and your business model has to work. It has to scale up. You need somebody who's capable of building a business. Supply chains matter. Manufacturing matters. The nuts and bolts of business might be incredibly boring. But if all you have is a visionary who cannot think about supply chains and manufacturing, you're going to crash and burn. You need a builder. Then you become a mature growth company. Remember, you're now big, you're trying to grow still. You have to be an opportunist. You've got to find new markets, geographically or in terms of products, to be able to grow. And then you become a stable, mature company. Everybody's coming after you. You need to play defense. You need a CEO who's good at playing defense, who's able to look around and say, hey, we have to watch out for that competition. And finally, you go into decline, especially if you're into acceptance. You want a CEO who understands that he shouldn't be making the business, or she shouldn't be making the business bigger. They should be making it smaller. They should be selling assets that no longer deliver value. As you go through the life cycle, you can see that the right person for your company is going to shift because the skill sets you need are going to be different. But if you look at that life cycle in CEOs, you can already see that you can get management mismatches. A CEO is not right for a company. How can that happen? The first is that you started off as a young startup with a visionary as a CEO. But you've now become a high growth or even a mature growth company. The same visionary is still there. The company is aged, but the management hasn't. You have a mismatch because the company has outgrown its management. Happens in a lot of startups and young companies. The second is the business changes, the management stays the same. So you used to be a high growth company. The management is right for the high growth company. Now you become a mature company and you still do the same things you did when you're a high growth company because you don't have the skill set to play defense. So the first two happen because the company and the management are both evolving and one evolves differently than the other. But once in a while you get mismatches because the board of directors went out and picked a CEO that was not right for the company. Why did they do that? They looked at reputation. I remember when Uber was looking for a new CEO and people were suggesting the CEOs of established, mature companies who'd been successful at running those companies. And my response is, it's not going to work. Uber is a young, high growth company. It needs a very different kind of management skill set than somebody who's run a mature company. You can hire the wrong people because you go based on reputation. And especially for mature and declining companies, sometimes you hire somebody because you so want to be young again. You're betting on a rebirth. Yahoo hiring Marissa Mayer. They wanted Marissa Mayer to make Yahoo into Google. It wasn't going to happen, but you reach for the stars. So you can have management mismatches. And when there's a mismatch, there are value consequences. In fact, you can think of 3 different scenarios when the management and the company are mismatched. In the malignant scenario, the mismatched CEO is doing things at the company that don't really reflect what the company needs. Effectively, you can destroy the company and value in trying to do things that you learned at a very different company in a different stage in the life cycle, but you insist on doing it for the company you're running now. At the other end, you can have a benign scenario where the mismatched CEO very quickly recognizes that he or she is mismatched and then tries to find a partner who can fix the mismatch. So let's say I am a mature company and I hire you and you're a visionary. And that's all you are good at, a visionary, to run the company. And you recognize very quickly that the skill set you need to run this mature company is very different. So you go out and hire a chief operating officer who makes the trains run on time and makes the business work, and you stick to your vision thing. In my view, that is what Steve Jobs did in his second iteration that he did not do in his first one. I was an Apple investor when Steve Jobs was CEO of Apple, and I remember the Lisa computer, one of the worst computers ever designed. And I remember when Steve Jobs almost destroyed Apple because he was a visionary who was headstrong. What was different for Steve Jobs in his second go around when he came back as CEO? He recognized that he was a visionary, and he recognized that he wasn't that good. He wasn't that interested in the business part of the business. So you know what he did? He hired a chief operating officer named Tim Cook, who made sure the iPhones got made and got to the stores in time. So that's a benign scenario where the mismatch is recognized and you deal with it. And there's an intermediate scenario where you don't do as much damage as you did in the malignant scenario, or you don't find the partner you did in the benign scenario, but the board of directors recognizes very quickly that they made a mistake and they replace you before you can do too much damage. But mismatches do happen. So what I'd like to talk about is the kinds of mismatches you get at each stage in the life cycle. Let's see what kinds of mismatches you can get at a startup. You can get a purist running your company. The problem with purists is purity. They can do things only their way. They will not accept compromises. And you can't build businesses without being pragmatic. So in technology companies, which are often started by technocrats, engineers, software writers, they might be brilliant at what they do. But if they're unwilling to compromise, they can ruin the business they're trying to build. The second is you can have a CEO who's fixated on control. Remember, at a startup, to raise capital, you have to give away ownership. If you refuse to give away ownership, you're going to skimp yourself of capital and essentially not be able to turn the startup around. You cannot have founders who are so caught up with control, and more control that they impede their own capital raises because they don't want to give up control. And thirdly, you can have a mismatch where you have a founder who's an amazing technocrat, but is not interested in building a business. He's not interested in supply chains. It bores him or her. You can have purists, you can have control freaks, and you can have technocrats. It's a mismatch at a startup. If you move up to high growth companies, there are two kinds of problems you can run into. One is CEOs who think growth at any cost. Scale up. Doesn't matter whether we make money. The last decade, we had companies run by CEOs who became single-minded about growth and never bothered to build a business model. That's at one extreme. At the other extreme, you can have a high growth company where you have CEOs who are very comfortable with what they've built, the niche business, who refuse to scale. Both are sins, scaling at any cost and refusing to scale at a high growth company. Mismatch. As you move to mature companies, you still have the scaling issue. You're the CEO of a mature company, you try to grow. You scale up over profits. You go for acquisitions because that's the only way you can keep growing. The other problem you can run into is CEOs, especially who've been around as CEOs for mature companies for a long time, and were CEOs during their glory years, chased the past. They tried to be what they used to be. They used to grow at 20% a year, and they want to grow now. So in both cases, you have the CEOs of mature companies reaching for something that's going to damage them. And if you look at mature, stable companies, you can have CEOs who have growth delusions. What are growth delusions? Basically, they think that they can go back to growth and they reach for it. They try to take projects and accept projects they shouldn't be accepting because they think growth is a given. You can also have CEOs who think their job is to build the biggest company, empire builders, even at the expense of their shareholders. And a fatal mistake you can make at a mature firm is not understanding why you make money. Remember, the source of value is a competitive advantage you have. There are CEOs who either don't know what their own competitive advantages are or have forgotten about them and they get distracted. You can get mismatches at young firms, mismatches at high growth, mismatches at mature growth, mismatches at mature stable firms. And then you look at declining firms. We've talked about this already, but might as well reinforce it. Remember the three pathways you can take. The only healthy one is acceptance, but you have denial. And there you deny your declining firm. You keep trying to go for growth, even though it's destroying your value. There's desperation, where you gamble your shareholders' money in trying to get yourself out of decline. And the third is CEOs who think that the end game for a business is survival. They've listened to their sustainability advisors way too much, and they try to keep the company alive at any cost. At every stage in the life cycle, you could get mismatches. And I think the problem has become worse in the 21st century. I don't know whether you remember, but in an earlier session on the life cycle, I talked about the compressed life cycle. How tech companies, the classic 21st century company, ages in dog years. It scales up much faster than the classic 20th century company. It doesn't stay at the top that long and declines much faster. And I gave the contrast between GE, which lasted 125 years, and Yahoo, which lasted 23 years. You're saying, so what? In the 20th century, because the life cycle was so long-term, management mismatches were taken care of by time. I might have mentioned this earlier, but I will repeat it again. Henry Ford was the perfect CEO for Ford in 1910 and 1915, a visionary building an automobile business and making it a mass market automobile business. But by the time you got to the 1930s and Ford was a much bigger, more established company, Henry Ford was actually outliving his welcome. Visionaries are also sometimes cranks. But he passed on. Time took care of the problem. A new management team came in. In the 20th century, time took care of transitions in management because the life cycle was really long. And the contrast I gave with Yahoo was the people running Yahoo in 1992 were running it in 2000 and 2005. And you could say the same thing about BlackBerry. You're more likely to see management mismatches with these compressed life cycles because the same management is around, but the company is shifting dramatically. The same CEO you celebrated as a star 5 or 10 years ago is now an impediment for the company. But here's what makes it worse. At exactly the time where we have to worry about mismatches and fixing them, we also have issues of how to change them. And I'll come back and talk about what it is we've done that's made change more difficult. But fixing mismatches requires changing management. In private businesses, how does that happen? If it's a founder-run business, especially one with venture capitalists, we talked about the founder's dilemma. At some point in time, if the founder is not the right person, the pressure for change comes from those venture capitalists pushing the founder out and replacing that founder with somebody who can run a business. With family-run business, it's trickier because change has to come from within the family, motivated by poor performance, and egos can get in the way. So with both founder-run and family-run businesses, change, if it happens, has to come from within. In public companies, the pressure for change often comes from outside. You're saying, why wouldn't the board of directors do it? Because the board of directors in most publicly traded companies is the CEO's handmaiden. They work with the CEO, they're rubber stamps. It's only if outsiders put pressure that you're going to see the board trying to replace incumbent managers. But changing management is key, and it happens. This is a graph of forcible CEO turnovers, where CEOs are replaced by the board. They don't retire, they don't move on, they're replaced. And you can see that at least in the US, CEOs do get replaced for lots of different reasons. As you look at that what causes that change, though, what is it that makes a private or a public company but especially a public company, change its CEO. Let's look at the catalyst at every stage. With startups, the catalyst is venture capitalists looking at the founder saying, you can't run a business. With young, high growth companies, the catalyst is usually from inside investors rather than outside investors. Because remember, if you have a young, high growth company, even if you're public, you're still concentrated. There are a few shareholders who own 15, 20%. If there's change, it's because one of those shareholders wake up and say, we've got to change the way the company is run. With high growth companies, it's usually individual or institutional investors who have large stakes. With mature companies, the change might come about either because of natural transitions, an existing CEO dies, or if you're a mature, stable company, it can come from activist investors, hedge funds putting pressure on the company. With declining companies, private equity funds become the catalyst for change. The key word is catalyst. Without something pushing for change, change will not happen. And here are the challenges you face in changing management. A couple of institutional. One is to change the management, especially of a publicly traded company. An outsider often has to have enough capital to acquire a stake to challenge the management. The more constrained capital is, the more difficult it is to raise large amounts of money. The more difficult it becomes to challenge management. Drexel Burnham, by opening a market for low-rated bonds, basically the junk bond market, opened the door for leveraged buyouts because it allowed investors, activist investors, to go out and raise capital to challenge management. The second set of institutional constraints is from the state. There are countries, there are states where it's more difficult to do takeovers because the state has put in impediments that protects incumbent management, makes it more difficult to change management. Across Europe, I think changing management is much more difficult than in the US because of constraints that have been put into the process. There are also constraints at the level of the company. The first is, and I'll give you an example of this, is if the company has skewed the game. Remember, in a traditional publicly traded company, every shareholder should have a vote and the votes should all be equal. If you somehow play the game where some shareholders' votes matter more than others, you've skewed the game. And I personally believe that the move towards ESG and stakeholder wealth maximization, both broadly based in the last decade or two, have made it more difficult to change management. You're saying, but ESG has governance in its name. The governance in ESG has nothing to do with holding managers accountable. In fact, the governance view of the world is, the ESG governance is basically that managers are accountable to everybody, to society, to employees, to consumers. A management is accountable to everybody, is accountable to no one. And in particular, if you look at the likelihood of change in management, there are characteristics that you can look at in companies where you can say, hey, this company you're more likely to see a management change. I'm pulling from lots of different studies here, so forgive me. First study actually found that small companies, you're more likely to see management change than big companies. Kind of makes sense, right? Companies that invest inefficiently, have lower accounting returns on invested capital, are more likely to see change than companies that invest well. Companies with low insider holdings are more likely to see change than companies where insiders own such a large stake it becomes difficult to challenge the company. Companies where the market has turned down on the company, trades at a lower price to book ratio, are more likely to see management change than companies where the market likes the company. There is this mythology that if you have a lot of cash, you're going to become the target of a takeover and management change. One study looked at it and found no relationship between how much cash you had as a company and whether management changed. And if you're looking specifically at CEO firing, the biggest driver of CEO firing is what your stock price has done in the 2 years, 3 years leading into the firing. Companies whose share prices have lagged the market, lagged their peer group, whose earnings and are underperforming in terms of earnings, are more likely to see the CEO be fired. It is true that smaller boards of directors are more likely to fire CEOs than larger boards. And the ownership structure seems to matter. Companies with high institutional investors see more forced CEO changes than companies with high insider holdings. And when you do see CEO firings, they tend to be concentrated in a few sectors. In other words, you see one paper and pulp company CEO lose a job, you're more likely to see more CEOs in that same sector lose their jobs. So let's talk about governance early in the life cycle. In startups and young companies, founder CEOs, if it's a private company, the only way they get pushed out is by VCs, but VCs are pretty aggressive about pushing out founders. If those companies go public, for a while, founders are put on a pedestal. They get more entrenched. So founder CEOs in private companies are more likely to be pushed out. They go public, the founder CEO becomes founder worship. That founder CEO gets more entrenched. And one thing that I think that troubles me about what's happened, especially in the last 20 years, is until about 20 years ago in the US, it was uncommon to find a company with two classes of shares. You're saying, what do you mean two classes of shares? Until 2004, when Google broke the mold and decided that this was the way they're going to go public, for a century in the US, the push was that shares were at a single class, every share had an equal voting right. Google, of course, changed that, and it listed on the NASDAQ, and it created two classes of shares, one with 10 times the voting rights as the other, and the insiders held on to the high voting right shares. And markets are okay with it. And because markets are okay with it, an increasing number of companies that have gone public in the last 20 years have gone with dual class shares. At exactly the time, remember we talked about compressed life cycles and why the need for change might be greater in the 21st century than in the 20th century. At the time when we should be valuing change more, we're making it more difficult by creating dual class shares. I think we will all, as investors, as citizens, regret the fact that we've entrenched power in the hands of founders, insiders at these companies. At mature companies, most shares tend to be held by institutions, and most institutions are passive. They can't afford to be activists. So if they don't like a company, they sell the shares and move on. So if there is change that happens at mature companies, it's not going to come from Fidelity or T. Rowe Price telling management they don't like what the company is doing. It's going to come from private equity. It's going to come from hedge funds. And they've become the players that push for change. What's helped them, though, is technology. Technology in the sense it's become easier to build coalitions on social media against publicly traded companies. It's become easy to seek out proxies to vote with you than it used to be. And as investors become more global, I think that you will see more challenges of managers. A French company where all the shareholders are French is less likely to see change than a French company whose shareholders are across all of Europe, because a German shareholder will have no qualms about challenging French management. Globalization, I think, is going to increase friction. And finally, at declining firms, the biggest issue is who will deliver the bad news. Because there's a lot of bad news to deliver, right, to different stakeholder groups. We're shrinking, you won't have a job. We're shrinking, I'm cutting you off as a supplier. We're shrinking, we're pulling that product off the market. As a publicly traded company, managers hate to deliver the bad news, even though it has to be delivered. So guess who becomes responsible for delivering the bad news? Hollywood's favorite villains, private equity investors. Now, I'm not saying private equity investors are run by angels, but often they're running companies where the bad news is going to happen anyway. And they have to package and present that bad news. And then they have to try to change these companies. In some cases, if a declining company is dead, it gets entangled in the legal system, and that can make governance a nightmare. Because now you have court oversight that determines how the company is run. So as you look across the life cycle, you can see that at each stage, change has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere, or something changes as you move through the life cycle. You're saying, what about family group companies? How are they governed? To begin with, family group companies have exactly the same issues as publicly traded companies. You can get mismatches of management and companies. One thing to recognize about family group companies, though, is you often have a portfolio of companies, some high growth, some mature, some declining. If you are a savvy family group, and every one of these companies has to be run by somebody from the family group, you should try to pick people within the family group who are best suited to the companies that need to be run. So it's probably somebody in the family group who's more of a visionary. He or she is in charge of the young high growth. Maybe there's somebody in the family group who's a natural defender. You're in charge of the mature company. And maybe there's a Larry the liquidator in your midst. You're in charge of the declining company. Of course, if you're willing to open up management to outsiders, it becomes easier because then you can go out and hire the right management for each company without having to look within the family group. But if you do have a mismatch at the very top of a family group, the patriarch or matriarch that's running the entire group is not matched up to the company, then you have soap operas. You see this with News Corp and Rupert Murdoch. What do? You could have companies that are worth tens of billions. You also saw this at Viacom with Sherry Redstone. If there is friction, a problem at the very top, you got to figure out a way to fix it. So let's bring it all together. The notion of a great management has always been around. We try to endow that great manager, the amazing CEO, with a skill set that we think applies across companies, but it doesn't. At each stage, the challenges you face are different. Early on, if you get a mismatch, it's because you have somebody who doesn't want to build a business, who's got a control fixation, has low interest in business building. The catalysts are often VCs or insiders. And the barriers to change are often the founder refuses to leave. As you move through the life cycle, the reason for the mismatch shifts. The catalyst shifts and the barriers become different. There is no one cookbook to fix management and governance at a company. It depends on where it's in the life cycle. I hope you found this session useful, and I thank you very much for listening.